I think one of the hardest parts, Eleanor is my first child, and so I didn't really know any different, but it was definitely not the expectation that she would be diagnosed with a rare condition. And I think that putting her in the sector of not having the genetic component made it even more confusing and almost self-doubting. Like, is this the right diagnosis? Is this truly what's going on with her? And after she was diagnosed, I mean, even before that, she had hospitalizations all the time. And after that, she had hospitalizations all the time. So my name is Maddison. My daughter's name is Eleanor, and she is currently 4 years old. She had her first seizure at 6 weeks old, and right before her second birthday, she was diagnosed with Glut-1 deficiency syndrome. She went on modified Atkins about 2 months after her diagnosis, and she was on it for almost 2 years. She was born 2 months early. She was in the NICU for like 30 days. She was like 4 pounds. She was itty bitty. In the NICU, she had a couple of weird episodes of like breath holding that delayed her release from the NICU a couple times. But they were always seen as pretty normal, or maybe she was choking. And so we were just kind of given instruction on what to do for like aspiration, things like that. And then we had her home for 2 weeks, and that's whenever she stopped breathing and had a full-blown seizure in the kitchen. I was holding her and she turned completely blue. It was a whole thing. And I thought she was maybe aspirating, but everything that I did wasn't helping, everything that I knew to do. And so whenever I called her pediatrician, he told me to take her immediately to the hospital. So we ended up going, and that was whenever they said the acid reflux stuff. They kept her for a few days, but that was really it. And then her second seizure, they had done a spinal tap on her in the first hospital stay, and that came back with low glucose in her spinal fluid, which matches the Glut-1 description. And so whenever she had her second seizure about a week later, I called her pediatrician, and that's whenever he told me about the results of that and said that she could be at risk of having a rare form of epilepsy. And so they still didn't really take it super seriously. They always just kind of said babies are weird, and babies, she's little and she's maybe just breath holding or whatever. But over time, her seizures started to be less of the breath holding and more staring and just having absent seizures a lot. And so whenever she was in daycare, her teacher would tell me about her just like staring off, and she couldn't really get her back. She started having a lot more of like the eye episodes. And basically over that next like 18 months, there were like tremors, things like that. It was like less big seizures and more these weird little neurological signs that something was wrong. So we kind of jumped forward, and then at 18 months, whenever we started trying to get the diagnosis and figure everything out, she was really just having those absent seizures and some tremors with the eye darting episodes. And then whenever she had the cookie a couple of years ago and had a seizure, that was actually her first seizure since she was her first big seizure since she was a baby. I don't know if it was like the just drastic change in her ketones, or if it was, I don't know what that was, but that was the first like big time one that she had in a while. But hers were always very under the surface, and you could barely tell that something was happening, but as you were watching her, you knew something was wrong, and there just nothing was quite fitting. The initial recommendation was a 3-to-1 ketogenic diet. So she was hospitalized and she was put onto the diet, and she was actually like within a couple of hours of eating the hospital food and doing everything and like the formula, we started keto-cal. Within like a couple of hours, she was already in ketosis. Like, she was super quick into it. And so they basically like backed it down and backed it down and backed it down all the way to modified Atkins. And so we started with that. So after about a week and a half in the hospital, that's kind of where we were. And it seemed to work really well for her. But there was no real other treatment option for her at the time. That was all that they could give us. She has cyclic vomiting, which does not mix very well with any kind of ketogenic anything. So she ended up in the hospital like once a month, once every couple weeks for the first year of even being on modified Atkins. And I think as a family, it just really, it's hard. It's hard because you don't have anybody else to relate to. My family doesn't relate to me because they've never been through this. And then even in the community, I found one family near me that does have a child with GLUT1 deficiency syndrome. So we kind of talk and chat. Like if I'm in the hospital with Eleanor or if they're in the hospital doing something, we'll, text each other and say how hard it is. But aside from that, there's just not very much relatability with our lives. And I feel like that's, from the very beginning, been a very difficult thing to even try to explain to other people. And it's hard for people to know how to help us, I think is the biggest part of it. But also just knowing that I had a before GLUT1 and an after GLUT1, and Eleanor never had a before, and this is just how her life is forever, I think is one of the most difficult parts of it, that I can't help her with it. I can only do so much, and I can only try new treatments and take her to doctors and do therapies, but I can't actually fix it. I think that was probably the hardest thing to swallow about the diagnosis. In 2021, she was diagnosed in 2020, and then in 2021, we had just kind of gotten done with a year of hospital stays all the time, and it was really traumatic. She had really bad cyclic vomiting, which is kind of they thought that it was in the beginning too, but it's kind of turned into like migraines, and I think it just kind of showed up as cyclic vomiting in the beginning. But it was like every 2 weeks on the dot, she would start throwing up to the point that she couldn't eat. So we would end up back in the hospital. She would have an NG tube put down her nose so that she could eat, and we would give her like ketogenic formula with some cornstarch in it to try to kind of cut it a little bit so that she didn't have acidosis as bad. And in 2021, she got COVID and was hospitalized because sickness brought out those symptoms too. So she would always start throwing up with anything. And we opted for a G tube. And so throughout that journey, there were several times that she had to use the G tube in her stomach to be able to kind of get back to eating after the cyclic vomiting. And at a certain point, it just was too much to let her be hospitalized over and over. And I just wanted to see if there was anything we could possibly do. So I talked to her neurologist. C7 oil is pretty difficult to get, but we were able to get some and start trying it. So we weaned her completely off the diet. It took a few weeks to kind of get her switched onto it, but it was last April that we weaned her completely off the diet and then onto C7 oil. Had to adjust that too because her stomach is so sensitive. So any oil or like major fatty sources, which is so unfortunate because that's what she has to have. But those always kind of trigger the vomiting for her, which triggers other seizure-like symptoms or, actual seizures. And so we just had to be pretty careful about the oil and what we did with it. But I feel like it's going really well. Modified Atkins is always on the back burner for us. It's always there and available. And I wanted, even whenever we took her off of it, I wanted to always remember that was always an option to go back to it. But I just wanted to see if there was anything we could do different. The fixing it thing. I'm just trying to fix it, but there's only so many things you can really do to fix it. So currently right now she's taking C7 oil, which is very similar to the same thing that we would do on modified Atkins, except she's allowed to eat what she wants and she takes the oil as like a supplement throughout the day. And so that's an option. It's been used for about 10 years in research with the GLUT1 community, but it doesn't work for everybody. I think it's about 50-50 on who it works for and who it doesn't. But it seems to be doing pretty well for her. It's been almost a year that she's been on that. So she's on Maddison. She's on Periactin for her migraines at a pretty high dose now because we've struggled a lot with the migraines recently. But I'm not sure if the oil helps or makes it worse because it's hard, like you said, it's hard to know what causes what. But whenever she stopped with the diet, the vomiting part stopped, but then it almost like changed it to where she's feeling it in her head and she starts to she'll still vomit, but it's not the same can't hold anything down kind of vomit. It's more of a she's nauseous and her head is spinning, so she's vomiting kind of way. Um, so it kind of switched it. So it's hard to know if it was the diet helping her migraines, and that's why we didn't have to really worry about that part of it, and we just saw it through vomiting and there was no head stuff, or is the oil kind of causing, I don't know, maybe she just got older and it just kind of changed it and it all, evolved a little bit, but that definitely has been a big change in the past year, that her migraines have switched to being, she feels it in her head and she'll tell me that her head hurts. So I think that over the year that Eleanor was hospitalized all the time, and we just kind of kept finding ourselves back in the same place. And every time you'd get out and you'd think that everything was good and they'd up our medicine of Periactin, and you'd kind of realize that things were going to be better. Like everything was going to be better now. We're back home. The excitement of being back home was huge. And every time we had to go back, I think was the hardest part. It's like reliving that trauma over and over and over again, where you're just laying there in the hospital room after the ER and they've poked your child a million times and they've shoved tubes down her nose and you can hear the feeding pump and the IV pump and all of that. I think realizing that you're never going to get away from that, and that that's always going to be a recurring thing in your life, is the hardest part. Whenever, I think it's, for some reason, the hardest part to me was never the doing it. I can always get it done. Like if you're in the ER and it's hectic and it's crazy and you're having to like hold your child down for them to, do whatever they need to do, it's hard, but I can always get through it. But it's whenever everything stops and the adrenaline stops and the room is quiet and you can finally hear the noises of the hospital and it's dark and you're like laying next to your 2-year-old or 3-year-old and you just realize that you can't do anything to change it and that they're always going to experience that, despite the fact that you want to fix it for them. You can't do anything and you're always going to end up back there. And now I know, in the beginning, whenever she was 6 weeks old, and I was like, okay, well, after this, the hard part's over. And then she was in the hospital again and again. And, now I don't even know how many hospitalizations she's had. And I look at my friends and their kids who have never been in the hospital or have been in the hospital like one time, or they get freaked out because their child has strep. And I'm just like, how is this my life? And how is this what happened to us? But I think now it's almost the acceptance of the fact that I know we're going to be back there again. I know we're going to have to go to the hospital again. And it's not a matter of if, it's always a when. But nothing prepares you for having to do it over and over. You'd think that you'd have like a go bag or a, backpack or like some sort of knowledge, but somehow I always end up in the ER with no food and my pajamas and like nothing with me. So there's no way to prepare for it, but there's at least a way to accept the fact that it's going to happen. I think I would share that life can look so normal, and that I think that it's easy to feel isolated and it's easy to feel very alone in the journey, but everyone kind of has their own little thing going on, whether it's another disorder or it's seizures or they're on a modified diet. And even though you feel so alone in the rareness of your life, it doesn't actually make you alone. And I feel like I didn't realize how big of a community there was in the Glut-1 community and how worldwide it was. But those people have become like family. So in the ways that I can't relate to my own family, I've found like a mom figure through Glenna, the director of the foundation, and I found friends and like sisters and other moms that have really been able to kind of guide me forward, and they're able to relate to everything that's going on in my life too. So I feel like at the very beginning, if I would have just had somebody tell me that I wasn't in this bubble, I wasn't just completely alone, it would have been really a lot less detrimental to my mental health for sure.